Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is John Krause and today we're discussing the regeneration conundrum, urban renewal without gentrification. Over the next hour or so, we'll be looking at, is gentrification positive? How do we gauge it? We'll be asking how planning policy can be optimized for inclusive regeneration, and how in practice can placemakers and developers effectively engage existing communities on regeneration. So without further ado, let's meet our experts. Firstly, based in Vienna in Austria, is Bahanur Nazia, architect and researcher at Utopia and project manager at PlayCity. Welcome to you, Bahanur.
Hello, very pleased to meet you all.
Thank you. And joining us today from London is Kieran Gunn-Jones, Senior Director and Head of Economics at Litchfields. Good to have you with us, Kieran.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody.
And last but by no means least, it's a pleasure to welcome Minouche Besters, partner at Stipo. Hello to you, Minouche.
Hello, John. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And Minouche is joining us from Haarlem in the Netherlands today. Now, for everyone listening from around the world, we always welcome your active involvement, so do please submit questions to our experts. It really helps to keep the conversation going and to make sure that we're talking about the issues that you want to hear about. If you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and we'll pick up as many of those questions as we can as we go through. So moving on to the first topic straight away, which is about indicators and the indicators, in fact, of gentrification. So Kieran, if I can turn to you first, you work alongside developers and investors. You're working with local enterprise partnerships and local authorities and helping them to develop place-based investment and delivery strategies. So the question I'd like to open with is, what are the economic and social markers by which we identify and or measure gentrification?
Thank you, John. Well, I think this is a question that people have been asking themselves probably since Ruth Glass first coined the phrase gentrification back in the mid-1960s, because it's clearly a very complex area and there are all sorts of different ways in which it can be measured. I think it's fair to say that traditionally the focus has tended to be on property values, particularly relative to incomes, and that early sense of people being priced out of areas as urban change and social change has taken place. But of course, property values are just one measure. They can be quite simplistic and they are influenced by lots of other factors in terms of the macroeconomy, housing market cycles and so on. Plus, they're not always reliable necessarily at a particularly local level. So over time, I think quite rightly, the metrics, the markers have tended to broaden out to reflect the different components and dimensions of regeneration and change. So today, more traditionally, we would look at deprivation, housing quality, education, access to services, and perhaps particularly pertinent in the current climate, health and care issues. And I think those are really important because actually that gives you a much better sense of the overall way in which a particular area's economic and social dimensions might be changing. Now, alongside all of that, it's certainly become in popular culture and the media quite relevant to refer to other metrics too. So we often see kind of fun things such as the number of coffee shops that have opened in a particular area, or certainly I know here in the UK, when a certain retailer opens in a particular area, that's often held up in the press as being, you know, the ultimate marker of gentrification. So I think probably to answer your question, John, there are different layers to this. And my sense of it is always that we need to have the broadest range of measures available if we are going to understand what, of course, is a very nuanced process of change, potentially at a local level.
Thank you. And amongst that long list of indicators, do you have any sense of which ones you think are perhaps the most reliable? And indeed, does their reliability tend to be consistent across different cities and in different regions, or are some indicators perhaps more reliable in different regions?
Well, probably the thing that has most bearing on it is is the lag time between the process of change happening and the data becoming available. So in the UK and indeed in many other countries, we often rely upon 10-year census figures, for example. But of course, that's a huge period of time, and that creates challenges for policymakers, because what it tends to mean is we're often looking in the rear view mirror, if you like, about a process that has already occurred, rather than necessarily being able to anticipate fully a process that is yet to come. So what I tend to say is you need a mix of real-time indicators that can be measured more regularly, perhaps on an annual basis, for example, as well as some of those longitudinal indicators that measure longer term change over time. I think you need both those things, and that's probably the best way of getting the most reliable picture of what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. So let me bring in perhaps Bahanur at this point. So listening to what we've heard Kieran say about, what the indicators are and the idea of having longer term and more, if you like, up-to-date real-time indicators and data associated with them. How does that square with your experience?
In my experience, and I can speak mostly for European cities, there are developments which are made in societies where you have already a kind of a protection of the people who are more vulnerable or have certain rights because they are living there for a long time and so on. There, the gentrification is kind of not as hardly felt as in communities where you don't have those measures. And therefore, I would say all those indicators depend so much on the context, and that's it's difficult to say here there's a development, there is a intervention, and I have those indicators, and that means that I have the feeling we have to read more in context, and it's very difficult gray area to come to a conclusion.
So if it's difficult in a grey area, how do you come to a conclusion? Is it inevitably impossible, or do we talk about perhaps degrees of uncertainty, or how do you make sense of these indicators in a way that's useful?
We have the project Place City, and there we go really in depth with two case cities. One city is Oslo, one city is Vienna, and we are working in a peripheric district where a lot of new development is happening. So we have a lot of conflict between old inhabitants and newcomers, and they are not equally represented neither in politics nor in economy nor in many ways. And but we know that these developments sometimes or mostly happen as social housing. So it's not gentrification in sense of that the poor or vulnerable are kicked out of a district. It's more really owning a place and having newcomers which kind of occupy a lot of land and disturb the old structure. They have new needs and so on. So it's a very, very complex topic, therefore. And we have the same situation also in Oslo. Our case district is close to the harbor, and there you have this grid or this strip which was developed in the last years, and behind that, more or less behind the rail tracks, you have the older multicultural district. So it's very very difficult topic to pinpoint only the gentrification aspect. It is a social development, and it affects the groups a lot, and we need for regeneration, redevelopment, or acts where we renew buildings and so on, a lot of accompanying and making sure that there is a dialogue between old, new interim users, passers-by, administration, and so on. So I would say the most important aspect, of course, we need some terms like gentrification, development, and so on, but the issue is very complex, and everyone concerned or working in this field needs to, is of course very, very alarmed about the processes, and there are many points in the process where you can adjust the development.
Thank you. Let me bring Manoush in at this point. The indicators, from everything you've heard so far, Manoush, are those the indicators that you think are appropriate, and the issues that we've seen flagged about those indicators, are they the ones that you recognize?
Yeah, I think like what Kieran and Bahanur was saying is it's complex, and you see many things, and it depends really a lot about the area that you work in or look at. What I tend to look at is there a mismatch? So what happens in a sense is that like cities are developing always, neighborhoods are developing always, and I guess what recently went wrong is that things go so fast that like what Kieran was saying, we're always looking in the rear side mirror. So we don't really see what's happening until the mismatch between people living in a certain area and the newcomers, the changing housing prices, but also the change in the prices for the shops, the rental prices there, that you see that all overnight it feels like, okay, my supermarket with the low prices is no longer there. I only have the biological supermarket. Or I want to move in this area, but the prices of the houses are just too far out for me to pay or to afford. But also, if I enter the street, is this still my street? Do I see people here around me that resemble me? Or has it changed so much that I no longer feel at home in my own area? So it has a lot to do with mismatch. And that, of course, is a very subtle thing. And it is, on the one hand, it has really hard figures because it's about prices, and it's about changes in amenities, in stores, in how spaces are used. But at the same time, it's also very subjective. It's how we feel. Do we still feel at home in these places? And what you see now is that a lot of the residents are really well, don't feel at home anymore, and they do come into action, and so there is this conflict, there's demonstrations, and people saying, oh, I don't want this gentrification in my neighborhood, and I understand that. So it's something that we really have to pay attention to.
Yeah, so interesting, this idea of things we can measure that are quite concrete and if you like, very factual and data-based, but also the less tangible stuff, like how people feel. I wonder if everyone that's listening, if you've got comments on that, thoughts or questions, please let us have them, and we'll put them to the panelists. We're going to move on to our next topic. While Manoush has got the microphone, this topic is really one for you to lead us on, please. And it's how do we turn around places in a way that's inclusive? So one of the projects I know, Manoush, that you've been working on is the Our City book, and that contains case studies and tools relevant to gentrification and related phenomena. So perhaps you could talk a bit about that and tell us what that tells us about how planning policy can be optimized for an inclusive approach to regeneration.
Yeah, thank you, John, for bringing up Our City. This is a book that we worked on with our partners in Europe, all placemakers and urbanists and developers and policymakers. And it's really about how it sometimes feels that gentrification is just happening. It's like there's nothing we can do about it. And I guess as Placemaking Europe, but also as Stipo and as other parties involved in making of the book, like Project for Public Spaces, we really wanted to give an answer to that, and really wanted to show that there are ways in which you can, you shouldn't be passive about the rapid changes in your neighborhoods. And there's really three things that I would like to say about it. Like, and the first thing is, we should look at, when we look at regeneration, and we want to do that in an area, we really should look at it as area development. An area of development in the proper sense. So it's not just about physical changes and renewal of houses, but it's also about the social infrastructure, and it's the organizational scheme in the area. How do people work together? And it's also going back to what is really the problem here. Often we come up with the solution and say, okay, we're gonna mix and make sure that the homogeneous, often poor areas there, that we're going to add new people, we're going to add people that have more buying power, so we have a more optimum of a mix, and that will create a better situation, a better neighborhood for all. But by going at it from purely a physical perspective and tearing down old houses and building new ones, we go by the idea of what in the neighborhood do people really see as a problem themselves, and what would they like to see regenerated? Is it the housing, or is it the public space, or is it the level of amenities? Or there could be so many things that are important, that you have to take that in consideration and then come up with a solution. And the second point is really about make the stakeholders in that area part of the whole. And so if a property developer comes in because you need to redevelop housing, tie them in as a partner, not just as someone building a property and then leaving again, but really tie them in as a partner for the whole of the area development. So also about the public space, also about creating affordable shopping space, or place management for the long run. And not just the property developer, but also the communities and the social organizations, and perhaps even the sports club or the shop owners association. They are all stakeholders in this area development, and by taking in all these considerations and all their ambitions, you get a better understanding, but also a better answer and more possibility to be really inclusive. Inclusive in the sense that you bring all partners in, but also that you really come up with solutions in that area that fit. So one of the things that we find very important, for instance, is to do soft mapping. What do people find really important in this area, and what do they want to keep? And that could be as much as a bowling alley, or the particular coffee shop on the corner, or that little park area, and really see if in the wider scale of the plan that you can fit that in, so that people will still recognize that later on. And the third part is that, of course, as a government or a local government, that you really tender well. So if you do your tenders, like for instance in the Netherlands, we have a 30% social housing requirement. You cannot build a new building without at least creating 30% social housing. That also goes for an area. So in that sense, you really make sure from the beginning that you create opportunities for housing for everyone. But Bahanoi, you're from Vienna, so you also have different options, like things that we're now just discovering in the Netherlands, is how can you also as a cooperative build houses? So not just commercial parties involved in property development, but also communities can be involved in property development. And how do we do that? And I believe in Austria it's called Genossenschaft, but I'm not sure. You might want to change that.
So level of enjoyability would be how you pronounce that. Translate that into English, or feeling of society. Is it Genossenschaft? You mean? So a sense of social cohesion and society.
Yeah, but also not just make property developers the only persons or the only organizations that can do property development. So also make sure that, of course, we in the Netherlands have social cooperations that do that, housing cooperations, but also like local communities do property development. In that way, you level the area, you create a level playing field, and you also make sure that profits are not the only thing that is important in developing housing. So a community property developer will look at completely different things than, for instance, a commercial property developer that aims for high profits or stock margins.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring in Kieran now and look at it from the UK perspective a little bit. Just looking at the comments online, Kaushal Patel and Harry Alexander, you're both asking for the name of the book again, so I'll repeat that. It's a book called Our City, and that's the book you need to look out for. Perhaps Minouche, if you can tell us a bit more about that book. Is there a particular reference to find it? Is it on a website where you've got further details of it, perhaps?
Yes, of course. The subtitle of the book is Countering Exclusion in Public Space, and it can be found at the STIPA website, and I think it also can be found at Placemaking Europe. You'll find a link there. At STIPA, you find a link to where you can buy it if you want to have a hard copy, but it's also free as a download.
Wonderful, thank you very much indeed. So Kieran, listening to some of that, I mean, you know, this idea in the Netherlands that a minimum proportion of facilities or buildings, you like houses in a development have to be affordable. One sees that in the UK, but in practice, developers find ways around that. What's the perspective you'd see from the UK?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'd very much agree and endorse many of the points that Minouche was making. And I think, I mean, generally, and from a UK perspective, I think planning policy over recent decades has got much better at considering regeneration and considering inclusive growth issues. I think there's been a lot of learning from previous decades, if you like, and perhaps some of those periods of time when, certainly in the UK, but of course in other European countries as well, where there were sort of quite top-down development projects imposed in sort of some of our main cities and towns. And I think broadly that position has changed for the better. And you know, many of the developers that I work with, I think, do now regard themselves as having a long-term role in the community that they are being active in, that they are conscious of the long-term dividend that they need to provide. It's part of their corporate social responsibility, but it's also very much around the sort of place-making agenda that, you know, runs at the heart of planning policy. So I think the position is getting better. What I would say, obviously, in any particular situation, of course, there may be local circumstances that will lead to a developer or a promoter looking to find routes around some of the clauses and the requirements put into policy, but that's something that has to be made on a case-by-case basis. But I guess the other point I wanted to make is that I think it's also important that while planning has a very fundamental role in all this, planning can't occur in a silo, and actually many of the issues that gentrification and regeneration touch upon link to other parts of public policy. So, for example, you know, how do we encourage and help people access education and improve education attainment? You know, how do we provide opportunities for training and skills? How do we make sure that communities, if they're undergoing change, can access, you know, affordable and cost-effective and accessible local infrastructure, for example. So I think as planners, we have a very big role to play in this, but I think a lot of the time planning has to work with other areas of urban and public policy to really give, in a sense, that complete picture of what inclusive regeneration is. And I think that's both in terms of the way we design the policy, but also picking up Manoush's point earlier about who are the delivery agents for that. Yes, it may well be a developer, but it doesn't have to be, or it may be about them working in partnership with other local stakeholders. And the most successful projects, I think, are those that have that built in from the outset and have that mentality at the kind of fore. And in a sense, that then helps the community to come along with the project.
Thank you. A lot of thoughts there, and I'm sure because in the UK at the moment we've got a planning white paper out. I'm sure many of the people listening will want to comment on what's happening in the UK and prospects for that white paper. I'd like to move us on to our next topic, which Bahanu is going to lead us on, because Bahanu's expertise is in as an architect, but also as a film producer. Involved in international research projects aiming to future-proof places and increase diversity and self-determination. So a real kind of grounding there in engagement issues. So Bahanu, the question for you is how can placemakers and developers effectively really engage communities to allay any fears they might have about gentrification arising from regeneration?
Thank you for the question. I would like to also respond to Minouche. The most important part of the whole creation of places, architecture, and city is that we have diverse actors who do this. And if we have diverse actors who produce, who adapt, and who change, then things will be always adequate to the situation, to the citizens, to the community. And yes, we have Genossenschafts where a lot of people come together to provide the best quality, best value for price in architecture and so on. But it's mainly for housing, which is, of course, one of the most important topics in architecture or urban planning. But we don't have, in many cities, also not in Austria, enough protection for businesses, local businesses, small businesses, affordable working places. And another thing is, in regards to policy, we have two development areas in Vienna, which one is Aspern and one is close to the main train station. And there, the aim was to give those some people, or at least a smaller community, the chance to install a seed to be a community, because all the blocks would be are in Croatian. So by such policies, or enabling small-scale developers or architecture producers and so on, we create a kind of human scale architecture, human scale city districts and so on. So, and this is also connected to my my work as researcher, architect, or as a filmmaker. I aim to bring forward the voices of people who need space for housing, for working, for recreation, or just simply to send their kids safe to school and so on. So for me, it's no matter if I'm planning, designing, researching, or doing policy recommendations and so on, we as Utopian, we aim to make sure that it benefits people. And if it benefits people, then there will be the process of collaboration, there will be the process of trusting each other, there will be a fair collaboration where the developer or the housing company or the administration gives the people some rights, gives the possibility to change, to have a voice, to shape, and people can give the other side, the professionals, let's say, the possibility to produce architecture or urban planning, the city in a way which is adequate, which can be used, which is useful for people. So for me, the question is not how can we, but how can we not? Because if we do this collaboration, all sides benefit, and there is a process of giving and getting, and it creates better ties. And we know that we don't produce bad quality or things which no one needs, and which are in fact also very vulnerable to changes in society, economy, and so on.
And you've got some very practical examples there, haven't you? And you know, I've heard of a share town tool that you've developed, and also a meetings place documentary. Can you tell us about one of those as a very practical example of how this engagement can work well?
Actually, the Begegnungsorte, which is the meeting places, captures stories or the identity of places which the people give to places. It's not like the Stephansplatz, the most touristic area or so, but it's the area where the wine bar owner gives concerts and so on. So it adds to the identity, where the citizens meet together or where the kids play together. So in the series of Begegnungsorte, meeting places, we capture the story of people who collectively work on an identity, on an improvement of place, or just spend time to keep the place and the community alive. Because in our opinion, this is the thing which is missing the ghost cities kind of, or the bad developed districts or neighborhoods. So we try to emphasize, which was pretty much naturally, organically happening in the past, but since we have development, we have a lot of migration and so on, which gets a little bit lost, try to capture this locality and this connection between people. And in terms of an example for this process, I would rather mention Largo Residencias in Lisbon, which started as a community placemaking project, which happened a lot in the public space. The team of Largo Residencias took over a problematic building, and they installed community cafes, artisan residency, hostels, and so on, and did a lot of activities, cultural activities in the public space. Gave also people who were vulnerable before opportunity to live or to work there. But this intervention was partially also the reason why gentrification happened, and by increasing the value of the district, the area became very touristic, and not protected areas, buildings were more and more sold or rented for touristic purposes. But the Largo Residencias, as such, this is a process, and Largo Residencias kept on helping the vulnerable or creating activities or making sure they have a space. And by now, after the COVID-19 or with the COVID-19, the tourism disappeared. So the place showed that none of our so preferred solutions for every district development solutions are really eternally functioning. So I think we can learn a lot from those examples. And as we produce articles, films, and so on to capture those things and make sure that people do not invest, not the administration, not the developers, but sometimes also house owners, that they don't hope that one solution which worked maybe in 990 cases will work also in their case, to also then to tell the story how to do it.
Thank you, and very interesting how some very positive change can be brought about, but by no means without risk. If you end up with a development of an area that's perhaps too reliant on one form of economic activity. Perhaps I can bring Minouche in to respond to some of that, and also perhaps to throw in a question from the audience. Deirdre Toussaint is asking, with an increasing focus on creating smart cities, how does gentrification remain an attainable goal within other costly drivers? So perhaps, Minouche, that's something you could comment on in answering also what Bahanu has been talking about.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question that Deirdre brought in. Can you repeat it, John?
Well, she's pointing in particular to the increasing focus on creating smart cities and whether gentrification remains an attainable goal within other costly drivers, as she describes them. That's the question. I don't really have any more detail than that. Deirdre, if you want to add any clarification, please do.
Yeah.
But that's the question as written.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't see gentrification as a goal. I think we look for cities that have neighborhoods and areas where there is balance, where people thrive, where there is opportunity to live and work and be an entrepreneur and grow your children. And I think that doesn't have to clash with smart city developments, as long as those smart city developments are not only technology based. So if we see them in the sense that it's all about getting large tech corporations involving in bringing in a lot of digital technology to our cities, it is not benefiting, not helping. But if we see smart also in a way that communities are resilient and take a role in becoming climate adaptive and in producing their own energy and taking care of each other, if we look at smart in that way, it's really about resilience. And I think communities, and I guess that is exactly what Bahanu was also saying. It's all about people. If we bring in all these different people with all their different talents and expertise together, and we bring them to the best use, and let them all and each play a role, then I think we have really resilient and good areas and places. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. Going back to the question about how can placemakers and developers actively engage communities, I would rather turn it around. It's not about engaging communities, it's about us as professionals engaging ourselves within the existing communities. There is so much expertise and activities in every area that you come. It's not about them participating in what we do. It is about us participating in what they do. And I think there's much to learn there. So, and that will really also tackle fears about regeneration and gentrification. I think often those fears are really valid. But often those fears also come up when plans are made without taking their perspectives and their ambitions and their fears and their needs into consideration. So if you really work on regeneration in a neighborhood, you do that with the existing community, and you really look at what is needed here, what are the wishes for people, what are the wishes for the people growing up, their kids in this neighborhood, what are the wishes for the shop owners. Maybe the school wants to have a new building, maybe the playground can be climate adaptive. There's so many things and so many expertise. And if you're really looking at it from that integral perspective, you collaborate from the beginning. And then it's not about engaging, because it was engagement from the beginning, because you do it together. And that also goes beyond the idea that participation is something that we have these really wonderful evenings where we tell people what we're going to do. No, we're not telling, we're creating it together. And also giving people the room to come up with their own solutions, but also execute their own solutions.
There's, I think few people would argue with any of that, but there's a point which Adrian Lockwood, who's listening, has made, which I can see makes a lot of sense. You know, he's saying, well, there are communities, particularly deprived communities, who are strongly reticent to engage. I mean, you know, one can imagine, can't one? You know, perhaps very deprived community where there's high levels of crime, people are very suspicious of the police, very suspicious of the local authorities. You know, how in practice can those sorts of communities really engage with the changes to the places they live when they have good reason perhaps to feel suspicious of anyone that would be in what they would see being in a position of power over them?
Yeah, I recognize the fear, but I don't recognize them in practice. I think in the book we have an excellent example about someone working together with a Roma community, strategizing with them for the next 10 years. Also from my personal experience, and I think this is also where placemaking really can help. I worked in areas where there were lots of drug related problems, and where the people felt that the local government had been looking away for like the last decade. So they had no trust. They had also no community, because everyone was just basically only looking to take care of themselves. So the only thing in the beginning that we did, and of course my position is different because I am not from the municipality, I'm not a property developer, I'm just a curious person that comes in. So I really want to be as neutral, but not, I'm connected to the place and to the people. So what we did in the beginning was just listening. And just seeing what are the things that people were really needing, and what were the things that they could come up with that would alleviate some of the pain, but also would help build trust. So the first year that I worked there was just about taking really, really small steps, but showing them that they could have big changes. And it's like simple things like the buildings there were really in a very bad shape, and people didn't want to be on the streets. But so they wanted color, they wanted to have flowers, they wanted to have, you know, different lamps, so there would be light in the evening. So this is what we did in the beginning with them. And only then, when you show that you really do act, and that the local government does step forward, and that the police do work with you, and that little measures have effect, you can start to talk, to have a different conversation, okay, about what is the strategy for the longer run. And it is possible to engage. I mean, I truly believe there are no people that you can't collaborate with. it just challenges us as professionals to come up with better ways to provide childcare if you want to talk with moms, to go to their houses if they don't come up to the county meeting. So you have to, it is a challenge for us, but I think we have to be creative, and that we can then really engage everyone.
Thank you. It's a great point. It's such a wonderful example, really bringing to life that how you can address these challenges in a positive way and make good progress. Kieran, let me bring you in, because there's a UK planning white paper. I mentioned that earlier. There's a reference in there to community engagement and participative design, I think it's referred to. Measures are envisaged whereby design codes will only be given weight where it can be demonstrated that local communities have been properly engaged in their production. What would be your take on what's going to be happening in the UK? Are we going to be seeing through that white paper the sort of very positive approaches that we've heard about elsewhere?
Well, I think it's a really important general point on this question, John, which is that, you know, too often perhaps communities are engaged at the point a particular development is happening, and often that's a development that's being brought forward in accordance with a plan that's already been approved and signed off by the local authority, etc. And what that often then means is that at that point that you're undertaking that development, and you may consult and engage with the community on it, sometimes the scope for maneuver or the ability to genuinely change and reflect what the community is saying at that point can become limited, because actually many of the principles have already been established in the relevant plan. And we know and see often that that becomes a point of frustration within communities, because essentially there's nothing actually local politicians or local professionals, council officers can do, because in a sense that is the policy position. So that, I think, segues very importantly then into this point that what the planning white paper in the UK is looking to do, and perhaps follows, you know, recent trends in the last couple of years that we've seen around the introduction of neighbourhood plans, for example, which has seen a programme nationally of local communities bringing forward plans for their neighbourhoods. I think what the white paper is looking to do is to very much bring the community into a more front-loaded process, whereby their views, concerns and expectations can be factored better into the plan that's being established for a particular area, so that then down the line, in a sense, the debate about individual development projects should already effectively factor in that plan that the community has bought into or has had a role in shaping. So I think that direction seems very clear. The government in the UK is very open about saying it wants to rebuild trust in the planning process, sensing that communities have become disaffected by it, and that actually the people that often engage in plan making processes are not the full community. And we touched on, and Manoush was describing around, I think in response to Adrian's question around actually how do you touch all parts of the community and hear their views. And I think the government alongside that approach is looking to, for example, make it easier for people to access planning information and plans, for example, using digital communications, but also simplifying the process, trying to take some of the jargon, take some of the technical elements out, so that people just get a much clearer sense of what their area will look like in the future. They feel able to participate in the debate about that area, and then, in theory at least, the process down the line of development then actually happening becomes something that fits with those expectations. So I think in overall terms, that must be a positive way forward. But of course, the devil will be in the details to how that can be implemented in practice.
And have we seen any examples in the UK of where that's already starting to happen? I can imagine, that, for instance, the difficulty people have with jargon, using technology to show people what a place will look like, using all of the modeling techniques that are already highly available for, virtual and augmented reality and so on. Is that already happening in the UK, or are we just really starting to experiment with it?
I think we're starting to experiment with it. I mean, you're absolutely right in a sense that the technology is moving quickly, and the ability now to actually show what the look and feel of a place could be in the future, to do that across different types of media, to do it in a much more engaging way, is now there. And I think one of the effects that the government in the UK is looking to do through its planning reforms is to effectively grow the kind of the sort of prop tech or plan tech sector. So to bring technology into what certainly in the UK is perhaps a sector that hasn't engaged with technology as quickly as some other sectors have, or some other areas of public policy have, and bring all of that into the fold, and to make that process more engaging. But I think we do need to be mindful, and as a previous or an earlier question indicated, you know, digital technology, there are issues about the accessibility, the relative accessibility that different communities have to that. We know there's been studies looking at digital poverty, for example. So as we take more and more of the information and the consultation online, and indeed potentially access to services online, we've got to make sure that the digital infrastructure is keeping pace with that, and actually in an effective and cost-effective way reaching some of those communities that perhaps traditionally may not have access to those resources.
Thank you. I want to move us on to our final topic, which is gentrification. Is it for better or for worse? Is it necessarily a bad thing? If not, what does good gentrification look like? We've already heard that gentrification perhaps is not a goal in itself. And perhaps, Kieran, I can just ask you to start on this one. And I've got a question I want to throw in from Andrea Roberts, who's saying, how can policymakers incentivize developers to build human scale developments? And she comments that often we see tall glass box generic developments, and we often see increased height is used as a means of achieving social and affordable housing units. So you just stack them high and sell them cheap, I suppose, to use a supermarket analogy. What can we do to incentivize policymakers to incentivize developers to make things human scale?
Well, I think a lot of the debate about development projects increasingly gets reduced down to a discussion about numbers. So in many ways, going back to the first question you asked at the outset, John, which was, you know, what is a project capable of delivering? And, you know, number of housing units, particularly in the UK, we have a system that requires local authorities to meet a certain level of housing provision each year. That system does tend to mean that often projects that can demonstrate they can deliver the most sort of housing units, if you like, are often the ones that are able to be approved. And I think you're absolutely right, or the question is absolutely right in saying, well, it can't always be about that, and actually that won't always be the right solution in every area. And what is interesting, going back to the planning white paper point, is it talks about the sort of pattern book, and every location across the country developing a local pattern book that starts to frame and shape what the appropriate scale and type and form of development in different areas should be. And I think that has to be something that's kind of welcome, because the reality otherwise is that the market will only deliver certain forms of development. And we see this in many cities globally, but of course the issues around land values and infrastructure costs, for example, tend to incentivize very naturally developers to essentially provide the kind of maximum number of units that they kind of can do. But I think we've got to work, and as we do with our developer clients, we need to work with them to understand what that local housing market might be in a particular area, so that it isn't necessarily mono tenure, it does reflect the particular needs of an area. And I think this is really important for the whole debate about gentrification and keeping communities and keeping social capital in an area. If you only put one form of development back, that naturally is going to limit or select effectively who will come into that area when your development is complete. And those people may not necessarily have a long-term investment in that area. What you actually want to do is to retain existing residents, to re-provide for their needs, but also to think ahead, to provide family housing, for example, and not just 1 or 2 bed apartments, for example. So I think this sense of really going back to the starting point of this session is, what is the life cycle of the people in a particular district of a city or a town? What are their needs? What are the things that determine, their life chances and choices? And putting the debate right back to that, which I think makes engagement a lot easier if you take the time to do that, but also means that going back to how you measure the outcomes of regeneration, you get that much broader view as to what is being achieved, rather than a very narrow focus on 1 or 2 metrics, which may just simply be around values or housing delivery, rather than the social value that you're creating through what you're trying to deliver.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to push it on a bit. But Bahanur, just your closing thoughts on this.
I believe that the gentrification as a term is perceived as a negative term, but we use a lot community-led development or regeneration, then it can be an improvement to the place. And those things happen if we have, for instance, as was mentioned, high crimes or not human scale development. We have a lot of high rises, a lot of traffic area, but no places for the community to be. Those things, those changes, those improvements are bettering the situation, the place, and are better for the community. So I think it's a terminology thing, but bottom line is we can do with every building we do, with every corner we design, with every shop we do, we can improve the situation for everyone. And I think it's very important that every one of us claims this right. And it's also very important that developers, planners, administration, and so on gives this right to the people.
Thank you. And we're really pushed for time. I'm going to give the very last word to Manoush very briefly. And I just want to throw in a final question. Stephen Hill, who's listening, is asking, how do we equip professionals in their education to develop necessary interpersonal skills for the sort of engagement we've been talking about? Is that something we've managed to do well? Are there good examples of that, Manoush?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you engage in all the placemaking networks around the world, so you have Placemaking Europe, you have a placemaking network in America, in South America, you have a Marken placemaking network in the Middle East. Those are networks where there's lots of workshops, where there are conferences. You have, of course, also PPS organizing the worldwide placemaking weeks. We ourselves, I mean, we as STIPO, we give trainings on the city at eye level, because also what you just said about the buildings, human skill is really about creating value in an area, and that goes beyond just the property value. I mean, if you create a building which has a really good plinth and which has a tremendous public space, and which is also has ownership by the community and by the entrepreneurs, you create more value for property owners than just creating a property. So I guess there is lots to learn. There's great examples, there's great literature on that, but I really would invite Stephen and many of you all to join one of the many placemaking networks and come to those conferences to learn about human skill development and placemaking, and creating better cities for all.
Thank you. That's some really useful tips there, and we'll try and include some of those in the write-up of this when we come to post that online. That is, I'm afraid, all we've got time for. So many thanks to our experts, Bahano Nazia at Utopia and Play City, Kieran Gunn-Jones at Litchfields, and Minouche Bestas at Stipo. A reminder that we will publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar online, so do please feel free to share those with your professional networks. Take a few moments, please, to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, and that will appear on your screens at the end of this webinar. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars and catch up on any that you may have missed. We also have a new podcast series, and you can download the WBEF app from the App Store or from Google Play. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your many questions and comments with us online. And until next time, goodbye.